I'm not giving up.
I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either gonna be okay.
No, stop!
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
Dynasties, not kings and centuries, measured the history of ancient Egypt. By the middle of the 4th century BC, the country had seen 30 such houses, as the Egyptians called them, and if the gods were so minded, there was no reason why there should not be 30 more. Kingship descended from heaven at the beginning of mythical times and settled in Heliopolis, the sun god's city. Proper performance of the rituals and continued rule by the throne-succeeding embodiments of kingship by Ma'at and common sense would ensure no end to the system, except for a cataclysm that would halt time itself. Furthermore, we could present more pragmatic arguments to calm the anxious. Deserts and seas surrounded Egypt, making it easy to defend, except for the weakness of its northeast frontier, which required constant monitoring. The country was naturally prosperous, at least when governed sensibly, and it attracted entrepreneurial skills from less fortunate countries in the Mediterranean and the Near East almost without effort. Younger nations marveled at its monuments and the length of its history, but they tended not to imitate its culture, which they perceived as unique. The gods would surely go on protecting the land they had created. With the perfect vision, which comes with hindsight, we can see that the gods issued a series of warnings throughout the late period. Pharaohs did not dominate the first millennium BC, unlike the second and third millennia. There were considerable achievements to show for it, but the country had increasingly known the need to dance to others' tunes. The first outright conquest of the country followed the prosperity of the Sate dynasty, and Egypt remained a province of the Persian Empire from 525 until 404 BC, when it succeeded in regaining precarious independence. This conquest had a complex mix of effects on a proud civilization, including passive aggression, Stockholm Syndrome, profiteering, seeking solace in the country's history and traditions, and denying any unusual events. In this manner, one could portray Cambyses, the Persian conqueror, as a descendant of one of the Senate pharaohs, thereby interpreting the so-called conquest as a form of reunion. In an entirely different tradition, the same Cambyses could become the murderer of the Apis bull and the enemy of everything sacred. Despite the likelihood that neither tradition is accurate, we retain both versions to comprehend the events. Egypt was the first country to shake off Achaemenid control except for the Greek city-states. However, when independence finally came, it did so at a price. The country needed foreign expertise, particularly Greek expertise, to reassert itself. Foreign observers had long suspected this to be the case, and now the Egyptians knew it too. This was a humiliation for a culture that prided itself on its likeness to no other. As it happens, the late period concentrates on precisely those aspects of ancient Egypt that made it different: the worship of animals, the distinctive cult of the dead. The seemingly endless spirals of its theology are captivating. However, this is also a period in which Egypt is experiencing a significant influx of foreign migrants. At first glance, these two tendencies appear incompatible, yet there is evidence to suggest their connection. One way of dealing with a melting pot of immigration is to emphasize culture and use it to override competing loyalties. By maintaining this balance, we can diffuse the tension between the native aristocracy's conservatism and the need to employ skills outside this aristocracy. we are addressing the question, what does it mean to be Egyptian in this changing world? The ruling elite's answer emphasizes the unique characteristics that set Egyptians apart. This policy was successful, and most immigrant communities assimilated and absorbed. The story of Joseph, which originates from the later period, serves as a prime illustration of this. This story portrays Joseph as a penniless immigrant who achieves fame and power by becoming more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves. The audience, initially consisting of men and women of Jewish descent who had chosen to settle by the Nile, would have understood this lesson. Joseph, the son of Jacob and Rachel, became an ancient Egyptian. The Achaemenids never gave up their claim to Egypt, which lent its character to the period after 404. Applying a contemporary comparison, the region exhibited a post-colonial mindset. Although Egypt was without the Achaemenids, the idea of them was always present. Power passed into the hands of rival families, especially in the Delta, and the most successful of these warlords are those known to us as Dynasty 29. While they may have fought for freedom, their willingness to share it after winning the battle is generally unknown. A powerful enemy at the gates has kept many a historical regime in operation. The new dynasty made the most of the constant threat from the former imperial power by implying that they were the only people who could keep the Persians at bay. Conversely, the Persians encouraged the rivalry between the Delta factions throughout the 4th century. This, in turn, compelled the princelings to establish connections with powers beyond the Persian Empire, which in practice meant reconnecting with the Greek world. Greek commanders and advisors became an essential part of the defense of the newly liberated province, but with a few exceptions, these friends of Egypt did not come to the country to study its antiquities and admire the hieroglyphs. They wanted payment, preferably in rigid currency. This meant that a country, which was naturally short of metal, needed to find the resources to either purchase coinage from abroad or manufacture its own. This could only be attributed to native Egyptians and wealth centers like temples. After a quarter of a century of independence, the immediate family of Dynasty 29 lost power to a distant relative, a military officer named Nectanebo from Sebennytos in the central delta. In traditional Hellenized terms, this man is Nectanebo, the first king of Dynasty XXX. If we characterize the previous dynasty as a tissue of warlords, the following dynasty resembles a military junta. This junta lost no time in appointing its members to key positions. The message would remain consistent. The Persians are advancing, and unprecedented circumstances necessitate unprecedented actions. Trust the generals. An honest observer will admit that there was some substance to this, and the following generation saw defeats for the Persians whenever they tried to reinvade. Nectanebo. I refrained from advancing the war into enemy territory, avoiding potential military danger abroad and political intrigue at home. The following reign unequivocally demonstrated the wisdom of this approach. His son Jeho, also known as Teos or Takos in Greek, succeeded Nectanebo II in 362 R.B.C. This prince needed more time, leading an amphibious operation against the Persian bases on the Phoenician coast, an area where the enemy had enough difficulties with its own satraps to hold out a chance of success. The plan came unstuck, partly through its ambition, but partly through mutual suspicions within the army. The fragmentary autobiography of Onofri, son of Pinmu, a priestly doctor, accompanies the expanded edition. However, a forged letter to his superiors denounces him. The atmosphere of intrigue and paranoia suggested by this inscription may well reflect the reality of the campaign. Another complicating factor was the rivalry between the young king and his principal military advisor, the king of Sparta turned soldier of fortune, Agesilaus. One expedition, however large, needed to be bigger for both of these personalities. Teos had undermined himself at home as much as abroad. Acting on the advice of his Greek financial pundits, the king introduced new forms of taxation to finance his campaign against the Persians. One was a poll tax, which proved to be as popular as poll taxes. and the other was an ad hoc levy on temple holdings. As the rising authority in Egypt, the pharaoh had the theoretical right to divert temple income for his own purposes. However, in practice, this policy was extremely risky as it involved making enemies of the scribal intelligence. Attacking temples could be seen as a slight on the gods and hostility to everything that made Egypt great. Seen in this light, Teos was not Egyptian. Some of the wealth raised by this stringent levy went into minting a series of gold coins, Greek in style but with Egyptian designs, intended to pay mercenaries. Despite their current status as collector's items, Teos would have benefited more if he had never minted them. His nephew, a young man named Nectanebo, led the majority of the army in Phoenicia in desertions. We now refer to him, inaccurately but more clearly, as Nectanebo II, and he stands as the final Egyptian pharaoh of Egypt. Plutarch, in his life of Agesilaos, paints an unforgettable picture of the 80-year-old king of Sparta addressing the new pharaoh, who was 60 years his junior, as Sixmania, young man, handing out unsolicited advice and departing for Greece with a golden handshake of 220 talents. Even in his 4th century condition, Pharaoh was still an employer for which to work. However, the pharaoh would not return to Phoenicia for a considerable period as the priestly classes swiftly erased the memory of Teos. He had fled to the old enemy and sat there dreaming of revenge. The hostility of Persia was understandable, but the affair of Tis would have reminded the more thoughtful Egyptians that they had much to fear from Agesilaos and his fellow citizens who were posing as their friends. However, the aging Spartans managed to provide one final favor to the regime by aiding and suppressing a coup d'etat in the Delta. Nectanebo was now the undisputed ruler, but the fate of his uncle Tis had taught him how precarious such a thing could be. Tis had not only taken on the gods, but he had run contrary to the spirit of the age. He had been impetuous, and to be impetuous was incompatible with being pious. Rashness and envy were the hallmarks of the god Seth, and this god was the everlasting enemy of Horus, the rightful heir to the throne of his father, Osiris. Nectanebo sensed that to survive, he must embody the spirit of the times and become the self-image of Egypt, the country created by the gods to serve them and enshrine their holiness. This may sound too rarefied to be convincing, but the Egyptians could envisage their country literally as the body of Osiris, divided into its parts by the power of his jealous rival, but still bringing forth life despite everything. Nectanebo transformed a necessity into a virtue, effectively summarizing his reign. We do not know whether he acted out of personal inclination or because of the moment's needs. Perhaps these two impulses coincided in his case. He was part of the military junta that took over the country, but had a very different image afterward. He became the dreamer of the Nile, the king who devoted himself to the traditions of a timeless Egypt, and the magician Pharaoh Nectanebo may have coined the tired phrase, a legend in his own lifetime, as this was precisely what he set out to achieve. The gods demanded piety from the king, and building temples was one of the most effective signs of this mentality. All pharaohs were expected to add to the stock of religious plants, though some did more than others, either because of the resources available to them or the length of their reigns, or as a consequence of personal religion, since particular monarchs could be drawn to particular combinations of gods, as we have seen in the case of Horemheb. Nevertheless, every pharaoh would contribute something to the estate of the gods, even if it was only the rebuilding of a collapsed chapel or the addition of a few cartouches on a wall left empty by a predecessor. This was normal, but with Nectanebo II, temple building became an obsession. Few sites in Egypt do not show some mark of his activity, whether it be repair work, extensions to temples that had long existed, gateways, avenues, shrines, or even whole new sanctuaries. Nectanebo II built the temple of Isis at Bebeit, near the dynasty's seat, Sebenitos, entirely from scratch, using the hardest granite instead of easy materials like sandstone. Nectanebo. I initiated this policy ranking second only to Ramesses II in the temple-building stakes for ancient Egypt. As we have seen, the latter had 67 years to build monuments, whereas Nectanebo I had only 18. The gods granted his great-nephew, Nectanebo II, 16 years, but the 30th dynasty's combined building work remains undeniably one of the most impressive in Egypt's history. It may even be the greatest, although the survival statistics lend it an advantage that earlier dynasties have lost. What lies behind this addiction to architecture? Temple buildings were germane to ancient Egypt in most periods, and the 30th dynasty emphasized piety more than many. This explains something, but there are deeper forces at work. One factor must have been the unsettling history the country had endured over the previous century and a half. The trauma of conquest, however, interpreted, had left a mark on the Egyptians. The Egyptians sought refuge in their long history, extending it further if necessary. Herodotus, who had visited the land in the middle of the 5th century BC, calculated from the information given to him by Egyptian priests that 1,340 years had elapsed from the time of the first recorded king until his own day. Given these figures, what did the upstart Greeks like Herodotus perceive as a fleeting Persian conquest, and who did they believe they were? The gods of the Greeks had their own names, to be sure, but anyone who looked upon the immense antiquity of Egypt would know that the true divinities were the Egyptian ones, from which it follows that the gods of the Greeks are merely the immemorial pharaonic deities with newfied names. Before the first king, these gods ruled over Egypt. Would protectors like these turn their backs on the land they favored above all others? At the same time, since the gods were wise and merciful, they must have tolerated the Persian conquest to inculcate a moral lesson. This lesson must involve piety, so we must return to the gods and double our efforts to appease them. Nectanebo lived up to the expectations placed on a pharaoh. It is no accident that the reign of this ruler saw the composition of an enigmatic text known to historians as the Demotic Chronicle, which survives on a papyrus now in Paris. This text records a series of oracles interpreted to refer to the kings who preceded Nectanebo. In this work, there is a clear link between the length of reign a particular king enjoyed and the attitude of the gods toward him.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
A typical entry runs as follows, elaborating on an excerpt from one of the oracles. The fourth ruler who came after the Medes was Samuthis. He did not exist means that he failed because he did not follow God's way. T-God Demotic Chronicle advises honoring the gods to live long, and Nectanebo planned to do so. Similarly, this dynasty should be recognized for another innovative action. There are references in several texts of the period to the cult of the royal statues. Images of the king were nothing new, but these specific statues received their own priesthoods and endowments intended for placement in the temples. This scheme replaced the disgraced Tes with his brother Tamus, the father of Nectanebo II. Propaganda typical of the regime transforms piety into tangible forms. The junta had established a close relationship with the gods. The growing cult of Nectanebo the Falcon demonstrated a more explicit use of propaganda. The king of Egypt had always been a manifestation of Horus, with the falcon serving as his emblem. However, Nectanebo typically takes this point literally. Horus had driven out the wicked Seth and sent him into eternal exile. The Medes suffered this fate, as did Teos. Nectanebo the Falcon was the living symbol of the protection that Egypt continued to need and receive. A statue in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, now embodies another concept elaboration. The statue depicts a youthful king wielding a scimitar in one hand and a hieroglyphic sign for a pavilion in the other. The king stands beneath the bosom of a large falcon. The whole is a visual play on the king's name, which means strong. The scimitar is Horus, the falcon, of Babate, the pavilion. Nectanebo II was one of the most image-conscious. The piety of Nectanebo's Egypt is somewhat introverted, but introversion was what the times required. The temples served as landowners and residences for gods, and as the center of much of the country's intellectual life. The learned classes, forced by Persian domination, learned the virtues of adaptability. They asserted, among other things, that Egyptian artisans created most of the palaces in imperial Persia, or insisted that the only competent doctors in the region were native to their own land. They adapted sections of Darius the Great's biography to form the legend of Sesostris, the Egyptian who conquered the world. After the departure of the Persians, Sesostris relied on his quick wit and low profile to thrive, or even survive, in the unstable world of the Delta warlords. Quiet conformity, both to men and gods, was the way to live. The wisdom literature of the late period makes much use of the figure of the silent man, who walks in the ways of the gods and avoids confrontation, exaggeration, and dangerous impulses. Teos had been quiet, and Nectanebo could not afford to repeat this mistake. Egyptian temples were not merely places for pious thinking. The temples were vital to the country's economy throughout its history. We have seen examples of this elsewhere in these chapters. During the reign of Nectanebo II, the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt owned the equivalent of 37 square kilometers of land in its own province alone, and it could boast estates in other parts of the country as well. The Temple of Edfu was far from being the wealthiest in the land. The crown, which in theory owned all the land in the country and leased it out, owned some of these estates outright, but leased others directly. This typifies a primitive economy, but it's important to note that modern England also exhibits similar characteristics. Temples paid tax on leased land and paid duty on manufactures such as textiles, papyrus, pharmacopoeia, and metalworking. To invest in the temple endowment was to build up the tax base of the crown, and the crown had to pay for the country's defense. Older treatments of the reign of Nectanebo tend to see him as a pharaonic version of Henry VI, squandering resources on unproductive piety and neglecting the politics of the day. The 30th dynasty and its predecessors closely linked religion and the economy. Notably, Cleopatra, whom nobody accuses of being ineffectual, did precisely the same thing, favoring the native temples and encouraging their economic expansion to pay for the country's defense and restore its former glory. Handing out gold coins to Greek mercenaries was rare but necessary. Piety was popular, and it was piety that minted gold. Nectanebo had another source of popularity and milked it for all it was worth. Egyptian religion always included magic as a means for gods to communicate with humans and each other. However, the 4th century BC was a favorable time to be a magician, since magic could be an antidote to the vicissitudes of an unstable age. The so-called healing statues, effigies of priests or other saintly figures, flourished during this era, adorned with hieroglyphic spells to heal physical illnesses and even moral deficiencies. Temple precincts housed the statues, most of which included a basin suitable for filling with holy water. The pilgrim or suppliant would drink this, absorbing the power of the inscriptions in their body. Statues of this type proliferate during the period, as do the stelae known as Sippi of Horus. These objects resemble boundary markers and occasionally consist of green or gray schist, a stone that held mystical significance for the Egyptians. The inscriptions covering these stelae describe the victory of the god serpents, scorpions, and all the demons of this world and the next. The Metropolitan Museum of Art also houses the Metternich stela, one of the finest examples. The master of all unknown terrors is Horus, or Nectanebo, the falcon, according to these texts. Since he can do this, he can easily handle the terrors of the known world, Persians included. Because he was the high priest of Horus and all the gods, Nectanebo embodied magic on earth. The story of the sorcerer's apprentice originated in ancient Egypt and would have been current at this period. Would an apprentice want to be disloyal to such a quaint but faithful sorcerer as Nectanebo? Egypt kept the Persian threat at bay until the summer of 343 BC. In 351, the enemy mounted an attempt at invasion, but this failed, partly through a system of command and control that bore on the farcical. Following the debacle, the Persians turned their attention to Phoenicia, which broke out in revolt. Nectanebo's magic was clearly working as it should. Eventually, however, even this abundant resource let him down. Artaxerxes, the Persian king, personally led the expedition of 343, having learned from the mistakes of the previous attempt. The Egyptians faced a 3-1 numerical disadvantage. The Egyptians captured Pelusium on the northeastern frontier, paving the way to Memphis. Treachery by some elements in a divided army completes the story. Alexander's entry into Egypt and subsequent pharaohs ended the short-lived Persian rule only 12 years later. Although hostile traditions exaggerate Persian atrocities within Egypt, the Persian side must have harbored a desire for revenge. Nectanebo fled the country, according to one source, in the direction of Ethiopia. The temple of Edfu, which he had so richly endowed, continued to date events to his reign for a further 2 years, but in practice, his rule over Egypt was at an end. The conquerors may have exiled or executed the king's son and heir, as evidenced by a statue depicting him. Nectanebo, as befits a wise pharaoh, had a magnificent sarcophagus prepared for himself, probably at Sebennytos or Behbeit. The Napoleonic expedition found it in use as a lustral basin in one of the city's mosques, but Nectanebo never laid his head in it. It is now in the British Museum. General Negwib, in the aftermath of the Officers' Revolution of 1952, allowed native Egyptians to rule the country after Nectanebo. The gods of Egypt were unusual in that they promised immortality to their faithful worshippers, and Nectanebo II received his afterlife. Nectanebo's role in tradition may not be as prominent as Khaemweis's, but it is more evocative because it stems from the magic he had worked so hard to create. It also became international. Around 6 BC, a teenager named Apollonios in Leiden wrote a Greek papyrus in Greek. Following Alexander's arrival in Egypt, Greek settlers occasionally developed an interest in the native literature, resulting in the preservation of translations of Egyptian writings in the Alexandrian library. The young Apollonios copied out a text known as the Dream of Nectanebo, whose phraseology indicates its original composition in Egyptian. The story begins on the night of 5-6 July 343 BC, when Nectanebo, true to his reputation, has a dream. He sees the goddess Isis, the lady of the temple of Behbeit, accompanied by the enormous figure of the god on gods, the lord of the city of Sebennytos, the dynastic home.
Need a laptop that's built to perform and designed to last all day? Select Windows 11 PCs starting at $499.99 are now at Best Buy. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
A burst pipe, a dead water heater, the AC calling it quits. Who do you call? HomeServe is an easy way to handle unexpected home repairs with plans covering stuff basic homeowners insurance usually won't. Instead of scrambling for a contractor, you make one call to get the repair process started. Join the millions of customers who trust HomeServe right now. Go to homeserve.com/podcast for 50% less your first year. That's homeserve.com/podcast. Savings compared to renewal price. Void in Florida.
No one has inscribed any hieroglyphs in the temple of Sebennytos due to neglect. The god Togoduli clarifies that this is not the king's fault, blaming Samaos, presumably the temple administrator. Nevertheless, it is the Pharaoh's job to make things good. On waking, the king begins searching for the fastest hieroglyph carver in the country, which throws up the name of a sculptor, Pedasus. However, Pedasus, like more than a few creative persons, turns out to be a heavy drinker. Despite his weariness, he finds his way to Sebennytos, where he encounters the most beautiful girl he has ever seen, the daughter of a street vendor. Unfortunately, Apollonios, the schoolboy scribe, broke off at this point and started sketching a picture of a man whose face would still resemble a face if turned upside down. we must speculate about the remainder of the story. The hieroglyphs got to be duly inscribed, and Nectanebo's temple program was gloriously plated. Alternatively, the Persian conquest might have punished Nectanebo's failure to meet the target, given that the tale's beginning date coincided closely with the final invasion. In any case, Nectanebo's exoneration was likely due to his status as a romantic and important figure in Ptolemaic Egypt, which prevented him from being permanently associated with failure. An unlikely source, the Romance of Alexander, reveals exactly how important the last ruler of independent Egypt became in later legend. This romance is a distillation of tales from various sources that came together in Alexandria after the death of its founder in 323 BC. Naturally, many of its elements are Egyptian, and Nectanebo, the king who lost his kingdom, has defeated the legend of the greatest conqueror. Many languages translated this work, and more people in the Middle Ages would have heard of Nectanebo, the king of Egypt, than Artaxerxes, the conqueror who replaced him. At the start of the romance, Nectanebo is defending his homeland using a bowl of water and some model ships, which he animates and then sinks with his magic. This strategy proves ineffective for some reason, prompting the king to disguise himself as an astrologer and relocate to Macedonia. There, he gains the friendship of Philip's queen, Olympias, who confides that her husband is anxious about a son. Olympias, a Dionysos initiate with a peculiar obsession with snakes, was well known in the story and in real life. Nectanebo immediately transforms into a serpent, a traditional symbol of royalty among the pharaohs, and invites himself into the queen's bed. As a result, Philip passes off Alexander as the child of the god Amgod or Ammon. This neatly combines the historical link between Alexander and the oracle of Ammon at Siwa with the myth of the divine birth of the Pharaoh, which we have seen elaborated by Hatshepsut. It also has the advantage of turning Alexander into an Egyptian, giving him the right to rule the country. After 525, Cambyses experienced a similar fate. It seemed that only one of its sons could conquer Egypt. A tame eagle, capable of sending dreams, accompanies the Egyptian king in the romance, potentially echoing the cult of Nectanebo the falcon. He takes on the role of Aristotle's tutor for the young Alexander. However, the would-be conqueror of the earth begins to lose patience with his unworldly and mystical teacher, and one day he throws him off a mountain into a pit. Here, Nectanebo has time to tell Alexander he is his true father. After that, he expires, king or no king. The prince, overcome with remorse, buries the Pharaoh in the Macedonian capital. This may be a simple echo of the death of Philip, but the detail is a little strange. The text continues as follows. It is proof of divine providence that Nectanebo the Egyptian was laid to rest in Macedonia in a Greek tomb, while Alexander the Macedonian was to be laid to rest in an Egyptian one. Everyone knew the facts about Alexander, but the information about Nectanebo seemed unnecessary and normal, given that he could have easily transported himself back to Egypt or any other place where tradition required it. Although the story is fictional, is it possible that this isolated fact holds true? Philip had plans to invade Asia and the Persian Empire at his death. A king of Egypt who wanted his world back could have done worse than to go to Philip's court, perhaps in the early 330s. Did Nectanebo stay there? And did he dream his dreams in the royal necropolis at Vergina, where Philip lay to rest? Few tourists who travel along the road from Cairo to the step pyramid at Saqqara pay attention to the desert wadi that runs west after the pyramids of Abusir. And even fewer who visit the galleries of Khaimweis's Serapeum realize that above their heads once lay a settlement with its temples, shops, guest rooms for pilgrims, and houses for many hundreds, now buried in the sand. The Greco-Roman Memphis shrines, built on the escarpment overlooking the valley, gave rise to this town. The temple of Imhotep, also known as Asclepios in Greek, was located somewhere in this area. The entire settlement soon took on the name Serapeum, and the characters of this chapter resided in this section of the necropolis during the first half of the 2nd century BC, approximately 5 generations after Alexander's death. Macedonian kings now ruled Egypt, and immigrants from most of the eastern Mediterranean flocked into the country, a hardly new story. However, the pull of Egyptian society, particularly its religion, remained powerful, and many of these latest immigrants embraced the culture in which they found themselves, becoming Egyptian or semi-Egyptian in the process. Momentous events affected the lives of the 5 obscure subjects of this chapter. The Ptolemaic kingdom in the 2nd century BC went through an internal crisis, which saw the secession of Alexandria from the rest of Egypt and a shaky attempt to rule with 2 kings at once. An external crisis followed as the collapse of a bombastic crusade against the Seleucid Empire in Syria resulted in defeat, invasion, and the humiliating action of an appeal to Rome. Revolts sprang up in the south and in the delta. At times, the Ptolemaic state, whose wealth had seemed limitless, came close to bankruptcy. Such unsettling times are aptly reflected in our characters, who seem to emerge from the darkness and disappear into it. The papers of 4 of these people, unearthed somewhere at Saqqara in the early 19th century, cover 168 to 152 BC. A few are now in Cairo, the rest are scattered among the museums of Europe. The main source for these is the monumental first volume of Ulrich Wilckens Urkunden der Ptolemierzeit, always abbreviated UPZ, a work that has never been superseded. The 5th volume, a discovery of the Egypt Exploration Society, came to light in the 1960s and 1970s, a century and a half after his companions. The first character is named Ptolemaios. We know something about his origins, but not as much as we would like. He mentions having gray hair in a 159 BC letter, suggesting he was born before 200. His birthplace was the village of Sychus in Middle Egypt. His father, Glaucias, a Macedonian soldier, settled there as a veteran. According to native documents, Ptolemaios identified himself as a Macedonian by descent, or Greek of Egyptian birth, as he described himself in a letter to the king. Around his 30th year, he became a recluse, or kato chao, in the Serapeum at Memphis. The nature of this strange title is still being determined. Some commentators argue that economic or social reasons led a man to become a temporary recluse, and it's plausible that authorities granted licenses to beg. Poverty may have had something to do with the decision, but other writers prefer a mystical or spiritual interpretation. Although the 2 explanations may be compatible, a Katokos could not leave the temple. As far as we know, Ptolemaios lived in a cell for the rest of his life. Pastophorion was located in the shrine of the Syrian goddess Astarte, situated by the great Serapeum itself. Even after his papers concluded on September 20th, 152, he continued to cling to his deity. However, the text of a petition he wrote to the king in 161 or 160 concerning his family suggests that he always considered Sychus his home. I, King Ptolemy and Queen Cleopatra, hail from Ptolemaios, who has been a recluse in the vast Serapeum of Memphis for the past 12 years. In the month of Thoth, in year 18, October 164, my father, a native of Sychus in the nome of Heracleopolis, died, leaving me in the temple above, and 3 brothers, Hippolos, Serapion, and Apollonios, in the said village. I have now learned that the village authorities are mistreating my brothers. I implore you, Savior and Benefactor gods, to watch over me, as I may not be able to leave the temple to assist them, especially since they are orphaned. Write to Sidius, the provincial governor, to ensure they are not mistreated, as they provide the bread for my life. I wish you to rule every land, grow old with your children, and prosper in your country. Farewell. Such protectiveness is a strong trait in Ptolemaios' character. His motives were not altruistic, but he was sincere. The habit of writing to the king went a long way back in Egypt, and Ptolemaios took to it assiduously. Ptolemaios preserved the initial drafts of his letters, riddled with misspellings and alterations, while he dispatched the final copies to his recipients, only to lose them. In another letter, dated October 164, he expresses his concern for a girl who had somehow entered his life. To the kings, Ptolemaios, son of Glaucias, has been imprisoned in the great palace of Memphis for the past 9 years. In the 7th year, during the month of Thoth, a person named Heraclea sought refuge in the sanctuary above and became my servant. Because I have no children, I adopted her. But Zoilos, a mace-bearer from the temple staff, obtained the wherewithal from certain persons and seized the girl. And because I was unable to leave the temple, he handed her over to one of the soldiers from Memphis. Therefore, I implore you, O greatest gods, saviors, and benefactors, to not overlook his attempt to enslave this Heraclea, nor to overlook his abduction of her, which goes against all morality. We are still determining the outcome of this petition and the current situation. The gentlemanly Wilken may have mistranslated the word adopted, and Ptolemy may have intended Heraclea to become his mother of children. We have never heard of such children, and Ptolemaeus never had another Heraclea. The contrast between the confinement of this man, which he constantly emphasizes, and his mind's journey beyond his walls, where he seeks to communicate with outsiders, often to the point of controlling them, quickly becomes evident. We will return to this conflict later. Whatever the truth, one might imagine that the life of a temple recluse was monotonous and free from incident. However, as evidenced by another petition, this was not the case. Ptolemaeus, the agent of the chief of police in the Anubian, and Amosis, the high priest's deputy, entered the shrine of Astarte on the 16th of Thoth, October 18th, 163, accompanied by police officers. They asserted the presence of hidden arms in the area and thoroughly searched the entire building, but they found nothing. The police officers kept a commotion near the exit, but nothing untoward happened. Eventually, at a late hour, Amosis returned with Imuthis, the agent of the overseer of subsidiary priests, and Harandotes, among others, carrying a lamp. He laid violent hands on me and proceeded to plunder the shrine, carrying off all that was portable and putting a seal on the rest. On the 17th of the same month, he returned early in the morning, carried off the remainder under seal, and even went so far as to plunder the savings of the other recluses. However, one Hermai identified the jar containing the money and possessed it. Unfazed, Amosis proceeded to seal this as well. Why did he even venture into the sacred sanctum of the goddess, ravaging it to the point of near destruction? Finally, he returned again, this time with Haramuthes, the agent of the temple inspector, and discovered a bronze vessel belonging to the goddess, which he removed. In addition to this, Pabelphus, son of Pete Harandotes, and Nectanebo, son of Lamouths, entered the shrine without any proper protocol, searched it, failed to find anything pertinent, and noticed a few lid cups which they decided not to leave behind. When I asked why they came, they said they were bailiffs. Therefore, I beg you, Zero Kings, not to abandon me to the onslaughts of these accused, but if it pleases you, to accept Demetrios, son of Sosos the Cretan, as my counsel, so that I may not leave the shrine, and to bring the accused before you, so that they may make amends to me before your judgment seat. If this happens, I will experience your salvation. Farewell. Ptolemaeus had cause for worry. Many of his papers address economic issues, including managing the house in Cycus, burdened by joint mortgages, and his fragile financial situation. At least in his last 2 years, he received an allowance of 7 drachmas a month from the temple authorities, but this clearly did not go far. He had sidelines, particularly dealing in pieces of linen and a distinctly strange trade in a sort of porridge, but these activities may have made him enemies in the necropolis. Like other recluses, he minded sums of money on behalf of others. He sometimes resorts to selling off his possessions, including a cow, to meet his financial needs. Constantly petitioning the king would have had its hidden costs in payments to petty officials. Much of his income has been spent on his protégés, and he sometimes sinks into despair. In another text, he cries, "My spirit fails me because of my confinement and because of his ward, Tawe. On what shall we live?" There are other sides to this kindly but troubled man. Educated, he associated literacy with Greek identity. Somewhere, he acquired a book on astronomy attributed to Eudoxos of Cnidos and wrote his own notes in its margins. If it weren't for Ptolemaios' unwieldy hand, we would have lost 2 epigrams on the Pharaoh's lighthouse and the temple of Arsinoe Zephyraitis outside Alexandria. One day, he instigated the writing of several lines from Euripides' Medea, a peculiar creation from this desert place. The lines are about the anguish of exile to a foreign land. When we last see Ptolemaios, he hopes as ever for his release, but this does not come. The second character is more fiery. He is the youngest brother of Ptolemaios, whom we have already encountered in the house at Cycus, and the adolescent who transcribed the opening lines of the Dream of Nectanebo. Given the significant age difference between the two brothers, possibly as much as 30 years, Apollonios occasionally refers to Ptolemaios as his father, a reference that may carry deeper meaning than just convention. Glaucias the soldier was dead, and Ptolemaios was now the head of the family. Soon, Apollonios takes on the role of his brother's secretary, and his handwriting stands out as superior, even though his spelling reveals he spoke Greek with an Egyptian accent. His Egyptian spelling is much better than his Greek, and one wonders if this was his first language. He could also write Demotic. This makes it likely that Apollonios' mother was Egyptian. Given the age difference, it may be that Apollonios is the child of a second wife, in which case he is strictly Ptolemaios' half-brother. However, it remains unspoken that both brothers might have shared a mother, implying that Ptolemaios was also partially Egyptian. This hybrid element in a Paul-Loose makeup goes some way to explaining his touchiness about his origins. Constantly, he laments the harsh treatment he receives from the Egyptians around him, despite the likelihood of their severe provocation. Nevertheless, Ptolemaios occasionally expresses the same sentiment. People here abuse me because I am a Greek. In the cramped and overcrowded Serapeum, amid political events and uncertainty, quarrels must have been frequent. We will revisit Apollonios' racial feelings, but they are not the only complex aspect of this volatile character. In particular, he exhibits ambivalence towards the religious beliefs that his elder brother holds, and he occasionally flirts with revolt. The following account captures the tone of much of his writing. I am writing to Poseidonios, the royal friend, herald, and governor, on behalf of Apollonios, son of Glaucias, a Macedonian. I am in detention in the magnificent Serapeum in Memphis. In year 23, 25 Paoni, July 23rd, 158, I went to the bulrush shop that is attached to the said shrine to buy some reeds, used for fuel. But the seller refused to sell the ones he normally sells to all his customers, trying to force on me others of a substandard variety. I demanded to buy the decent ones, which he gave to me in a threatening manner. I took them and went back to my cell. Later, however, the shopkeeper's sons, Petaos and Teos, arrived carrying staves and charged into the cell where I live without any decency. As individuals, they insulted me and thrashed me with their staves, extorting money on top of what they had already obtained. Neither the sanctity of the temple nor the law deterred them. For these reasons, I take refuge with you and urge, if it pleases you, that you summon them so that I may obtain justice. Nathaniel Julius Reich, an Egyptologist who had emigrated from Europe to the United States, studied the quarrel between Apollonius and the shopkeeper's sons in the 1930s. This eccentric character stands in marked contrast to the magisterial Wilken. While Wilken's prose is tight with scholarship, Reich consistently needs to improve his hesitating English. However, Reich is the better interpreter of Apollonios, as he understands this rootless adolescent in a way that Wilken could not. He also demonstrated that Apollonios must have erred in his dispute with the shopkeeper, as the boy's youth had overcome his caution. This letter reveals a peculiar development, as Apollonios now refers to himself as a katokos, mirroring his elder brother. This state of affairs lasted a mere 8 months, from February to September 158, and it is typical of the younger man to leap in and out of an institution from which Ptolemaios can find no release. If economic circumstances force this action, it is surprising that neither brother mentions them, whereas if the Katochoi were driven by an inner compulsion, the matter becomes extremely difficult to chart. The psychological explanation may be correct, but it poses currently unresolvable questions. Unsurprisingly, Ptolemaios is quickly strategizing a completely different future for his brother. Ptolemaios independently informs us that he has decided to enlist Apollonios in the army, a profession his father had previously pursued. A long document, UPZ-14, contains a day-by-day account. The affair began on October 3, 158, when Ptolemaios, not for the first time, wrote to the king. Having regained his liberty, Apollonios throws the petition through the window of the nearby Anubiaion, where the king was staying during a state visit. We don't record the king's immediate reaction, but a scribe or the ruler quickly returns the petition with a comment. Do it, but report back how much it will cost. Apollonios then carries the document to Demetrios, the quartermaster, who instructs a department to draw up the necessary information. There follows an excruciating list of reports to departments, sub-departments, and secretaries, with memoranda to each giving full details of the circumstances and copies in triplicate to be addressed to the army officials, the Memphite authorities, and the Pay Corps. Eventually, in February 157, Apollonios received his papers, which were delivered to be read to the chancellor, and I received back the decree from Ptolemaios, the memorandum drafter, and the letter from Epimenides. And I conveyed them to Isidoros the Autotelic, and from him I carried them to Philoxenos, and from him to Artemon, and from him to Lycos, and he made a rough draft. And I brought that to Serapion in the office of the secretary, and from him to Eubios, and from him to Dorian. And he made a rough draft, and then back again to Serapion. And they were handed in to be read to the chancellor, and I received them back from Epimenides, and I carried them to Serapion, and he wrote to Nicanor, and Nicanor wrote 2 letters, one to Dorian the Epilates, and one to Posidonios, the governor of the Memphite nome. We have encountered ancient bureaucracy in previous chapters, and it is satisfying to observe that the Greeks managed to refine it to this extent. If you're curious about why the Hellenistic monarchies collapsed upon the arrival of the Romans, consider reading UPZ-14t. After all this, Apollonios received an unpaid posting, which led him to supplement his income by working as a police informant, a job that literally gave him nightmares. This rather shady outcome may explain some of the hostility that both brothers attracted in the Serapeum. Ptolemaios and Apollonios' relationships with the authorities seem to have been close, and this could well have made them suspicious, especially of the Egyptians who surrounded them. The next characters unite, a fitting pairing given their twin status. Taus and Tawe are the daughters of an Egyptian who had been a friend of Ptolemaios, the Greek. UPZ-19 contains an account of their early life. Their mother is a woman named Nephoris. To King Ptolemy and Queen Cleopatra, the gods Philometors, greetings. The twins, Taus and Tawe, serving in the Memphite Serapeum, offer libations to Serapis on behalf of you and your offspring. Nephoris and her son Pacrates have grievously wronged us, and we seek refuge in you for justice. They said Nephoris left our father and went to live with Philippos, a soldier from Memphis. Then she arranged for Philippos to attempt to save our father's life. He sat by the door of his house, which lies by the river near the Egyptian market. But as our father came out, he realized what was happening and scrambled into the river. He managed to escape to an island, where he was rescued by a passing boat, but he could not bring himself to return to the bank and went instead to the name of Heracleopolis, where, because we were no longer with him, he died of grief. His brother sailed upstream and brought his body back to the Memphite necropolis, but Nephoris was not troubled enough to bury him. His belongings, which had been deposited in the royal treasury, were appropriated by Nephoris, and she sold 1/2 of the house, though it was ours as well as hers, for 7 talents of bronze. She acquired a property worth 60 talents and received a monthly rent of 400 drachmas from it, but she did not share any of this with us. Not content with this, she threw us out, and we faced starvation. But a certain Ptolemaios, one of the recluses in the Serapeum, who had been a friend of our father's, took us in. At that moment, mourning for the Apis was declared, and they hired us to make the lamentations for the god. Thus the twins' fortunes changed when an Apis bull unexpectedly died on April 6, 164 BC. We are still in ancient Egypt, even though letters to the authorities are now in Greek. The twins had a job, impersonating the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, and their duties were presumably light. But this was not the end of their troubles, since Pancrates, their half-brother, succeeded in embezzling their salary. Many of Ptolemaio's papers concern the financial affairs of these Egyptian girls, about whom he is constantly worrying. It is rare to be able to enter the minds of any people, ancient or modern, but the characters of the Serapeum are exceptional, because all four of them have left us accounts of their dreams. Ptolemaios wrote his dreams down in Greek, while the twins' dreams are demotic, as expected. Apollonius also shows a preference for the Egyptian language. Dream texts are notoriously difficult to interpret, but it is impossible not to be drawn into this sort of thing when confronted with such confiding material. Here is a miscellany from Ptolemaios' hand. The twin Tawe had a dream on 17 Pacons, corresponding to June 16th. She dreamt that she was walking along the street and counting 9 houses. I wanted to turn back and say, "These make 9 at the most." They said, "Yes, you are free to go." I responded, "It's already late for me." During the moon festival on 25 Pacons, Ptolemaios witnessed a vision. I dreamt. Tawe spoke well, with a sweet voice and a happy spirit. I could see Taos laughing, and her foot was well and whole. The 29th. 2 men are working in the forecourt, and Taos is sitting on the stairs joking with them. Suddenly, she hears Chentosnu's voice, and her mood immediately changes. They said they would teach her. The dream of Ptolemaios on 15 Pacons, June 13th, 16. 2 men stood beside me saying, "Ptolemaios, take the money for the blood." They counted out 100 drachmas for me, but they gave Tawe, the twin bronze staters, a full bundle. They say to her, "See the money for the blood." I say to them, "She has more money than me." Year 23, 4 Pacons, June 158. I dreamt that I called upon the great god Amun to come to me from the north with his 2 consorts, and finally he came. In my dream I saw a cow in labor. Amun seizes the cow and flings it to the ground. He thrusts his hand into her body and brings forth a bull. What I saw in my dream may be well with me.
Could AI help you do more of what you love? Workday is the AI platform for HR and finance that actually knows your business. We help you handle the have-to-dos so you can focus on the can't-wait-to-dos. It's a new Workday.
23. Pacons, my birthday. This is as labyrinthine as dreams can be, but certain themes are clear. Ptolemaios seems to interpret the bull's birth in the final dream to mean that he will be released from his confinement, and the same longing may lie behind his words in the first dream. It is also striking to see the complexity of his feelings toward the twins, some aspects he would never have admitted consciously. The second dream shows his clear concern for their well-being, but the third dream reveals an irritation that the sister Taos is not under his control, an emotion that may have a sexual element. The fourth dream seems to harbor jealousy towards the other twin, while the opening scene reverberates with impatience towards Tao. Such reactions need not be permanent. They may have resulted from trivial passing incidents, and one of the functions of these dreams would have been to release the tensions of an enclosed life. Apollonios needs more subtlety, delivering his points directly and in Egyptian. The first dream. I am walking along the avenue of Serapis with a woman called Tawe, who is a virgin. I talk to her, saying, "Tawe, is your heart troubled because I seduced you?" She responds, It's unfortunate that Totortais and my sister are upset with me, accusing me of being a whore. The second. A singer sings. Apollonios speaks Greek. Petiharenpi speaks Egyptian. The one who knows is this priest. The third scenario involves me and my elder brother in our home. He is weeping before me, saying, "I have ceased my blessings, and my hand has passed them by." I reply, "Do not be afraid." The fourth scenario involves a man who has arrived at the asylum as a rebel. He said, "The goddess Sekhmet told me to touch the lamp in the Serapeum, and this made all my men delay." I replied, "They will not oppose you because of the lamp. You will initially please them, but an investigation will set you back." This reveals several aspects of Apollonius. He appears more helpful toward others than his public persona would suggest. He has some kind words for the rebel and tries to comfort his elder brother in his despondency, although this may be a reversal of the normal relations between the two. Ptolemaeus can never have entered the house where Apollonius lived, so at least one aspect of this scene is fictional. The most vivid dream begins with the seemingly gratuitous revelation that Tawe is a virgin, undermining the impact of the subsequent words. Apollonios did not seduce Tawe, and virginity was a requirement for the ritual office that Taos and her sister occupied. The second dream, though short, is very revealing. It brings to the fore the preoccupation with trying to reconcile the two races, which is one of the young man's greatest problems. Petiharenpi, the Egyptian equivalent or translation of Apollonios, is almost certainly the name he used when speaking in Egyptian. It may be his real name. However, the final dream provides the most insight. Here, a religious scruple delays the young man's encounter with a rebel, perfectly encapsulating Apollonios' character. In this dream, he comes near to analyzing himself. The final speech is remarkable. The words may suggest a temporary resolution to the conflict at the core of his personality, but ultimately, initiating an investigation will inevitably lead to a crisis. However, this situation is challenging, making it easier to move forward. The twins' dreams have a quieter tone. The following are written in Demotic on a potsherd and are now in St. Petersburg. We are unsure which sister is speaking. In my first dream, I found myself in Memphis. I dreamt that the water had flooded up to the statue of Wahibre. My mother was standing on the bank. I cast off my clothes and threw them up into the sky. I swam towards her, to the eastern side. I took some more clothes from Tanupi, the washerwoman, and said to her, "This is the second time I have crossed over to you. I have already made my way to you. As you can see, I've reached the landing stage. I did it, and I lodged safely in your house." She greeted me with the words, "I have received you." Another dream. I found myself in the house of Shepanupi. I dreamed that he had wedded Senkai, the woman I had met. They conversed with him, expressing their love for her. But I replied, "She loves her mother, while his heart loves the one he loves." The text was penned on day 6, September 2nd, 160, in the year 24 in Mysore. The most obvious feature of these dreams is the preoccupation with the mother. First, deciding whether the person being addressed is the mother or the washerwoman is difficult, but one can be forgiven for wondering whether it makes much difference. Particularly moving is the twins' reception into the house, from which, in reality, she had been excluded. Vilken, as charitable as ever, concluded that this dream was history, and that there had been a reconciliation between the twins and their mother. But it is more likely that we are dealing with wish fulfillment. The riverbank appears in the dream, which makes sense given that it was the location of the twins' father's murder attempt. The next dream is also revelatory. Marriage was presumably a subject that occupied the minds of Taos and Tawe, and one wonders whether butting into conversations was also characteristic of them. Once again, the mother invades their thoughts. However, most people see the twins through the eyes of others. The most vivid impression comes from a letter of Ptolemaios to his friend Demoxenos, which he dictated to his younger brother. Year 22, 12 TB, running into the 13th, night of February 11, 159. I dreamt I was in Memphis, walking from west to east, and stumbled over a pile of hay, and a man came towards me from the west and stumbled over it. Unexpectedly, I opened my eyes to see the twins in the school of Thothys. They called out. I said, "Take care not to be faint-hearted. They will find it difficult to track me down, for I have changed my bed." I heard Thothys say, "Get out of here immediately. What are you saying? I will bring the twins to meet you." Then I tell you I saw him bring them. I walked before them to seize them, and stepped into the street with them. I told them, "I have only a short time in the world, and soon everything I was will be no more." But immediately, I saw one of them running off to a nearby house, where she squatted and urinated, and I saw that the other one had gone. And I saw many other things, and once again I prayed to Serapis and Isis, saying, "Come to me, Lady of the Gods, show grace, and listen to me. Please have mercy on the twins, for you instituted them as twins in the Apis rituals. Release me. Behold my gray hairs for. I know that in a short time I shall be dead. However, they are women. Their purity will never return once defiled." On the 14th, I dreamt of being in Alexandria, on top of a high tower. I had a beautiful face, and I did not want to show it to anyone because it was beautiful. An older woman sat by me, and a crowd gathered from north and east. They cried out that a man had been burnt to ashes. But she said to me, "Wait a little, and I will take you to the guardian spirit Knephis, so that you may worship him." And in my dream, I said to one of the elders, "Father, did you not see this vision that I saw?" I described it to him. He gave me 2 reeds. I looked up suddenly and saw Knephis. "Be joyful, all who are with me. Release is not far off. I have witnessed other, more exquisite things. You know my aim is for the twins to find a safe harbor. I am not worried about anything else. Send for the twins and tell them that I am coming out. Amosis has come to me. He has shown me the way and opened the shrine's doors before me." The power of these words is irresistible, yet an outsider might question Ptolemaios' sanity. The religious system that he lived under is indeed alien to a modern mind, but this in itself does not make a person insane. We only know a few things about Ptolemaios, but his behavior is not wildly unpredictable. The large number of academic papers he has left show a mind in control of itself, if a little obsessed with detail. And in general, it is unlikely that the Katachoi were confined lunatics. Dreams of this sort were the things that kept him sane. It is more profitable to see how his character unfolds in this letter. His concern for the twins, combined with a fear of their independence. His pessimism, followed by fits of optimism that protest too much. And his self-effacing exhibitionism. I had a beautiful face, but I didn't want to show it to anyone because it was so beautiful. Beautiful faces could be a sign of divinity in the ancient world, but lurking behind this is the paradox that makes Ptolemaios write letters to the king on behalf of a family he hides from. Incidentally, most of his predictions were wrong. The god did not let him go, and he was still alive 7 years later despite his gray hairs. Apollonios must have found his brother's complex, but when it finally came, the aftermath of his rejection was unmistakable. The incident that prompted the following letter is obscure, but the real issue is clear. The date of UZ70 is around 156 BC. Apollonios to Ptolemaios, his father's greetings. I swear by Serapis that you would never see my face again if I did not feel ashamed. Because you lie in everything, and the gods who are with you lie also, and because you have thrown us into a great mire where we may die, and whenever you see that we are on the point of being saved, it is then that we sink. Please recognize that the fugitive will attempt to disrupt the situation, as we have fined him 15 talents. The governor is coming to the Serapeum tomorrow, and will spend 2 days feasting in the Anubian. However, there is no place in Trichomia where I can conceal my shame at how we have sold ourselves, stumbling along, deceived by the gods, and believing in dreams. Farewell. In the left-hand margin of the note is scrawled the afterthought against all those who tell the truth. In this context, Trichomia seems like the world despite its uncertainty. Howard Carter, in his account of the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, remarked on the bowl of mortar left by the door, the fingerprints on the wall, and the footprints of the mourners in the dust, things that annihilate time and turn the observer into an intruder. This letter does the same, over 22 centuries. Hor, or Horus, son of Harendotes, was a minor Egyptian priest. His writings, in this case on potsherds, ostraca, rather than papyrus, are similar to those of Ptolemaios and contain much the same mixture of factual and spiritual petitions, memoranda, accounts, and dreams. His writings are in Demotic, except a small number in fumbling Greek. Despite the discovery of his documents at Saqqara, Hor's origins lie in the Delta, specifically in the town of Pythoth, in the province of Sebennytos, where he received training as a priest Ovalsis in a nearby temple. He was born slightly before 200 BC and is a contemporary of Ptolemaios. Sometime after 165 BC, Hor received a divine instruction to settle in the ibis shrine of the god Thoth, near the Serapeum, and he became a neighbor of Ptolemaios and his wards. There is no proof that he knew them, apart from a small ostracon among his collection that mentions an anonymous pair of twins, but it is extremely likely, given the proximity of all 5 characters and the interests they shared. Hor of Sebennytos worked at the ibis shrine as a secretary and probably as an advisor on dreams and oracles, since he already had a reputation for such things before he settled at Saqqara. Early in his life, Hor of Sebennytos rose to a surprisingly high level in national politics, recounting his dream while serving in the Ptolemaic army during Antiochus Epiphanes' invasion. Hor Text 1. This perilous event occurred in 168 BC and ended only after the Romans intervened. In year 23, Hathor, December 159, I reported to Soterion, the scribe of the Pharaoh at Memphis, the matter that had come true when Antiochus was to the north of Piolaios and Egypt was torn apart. I spoke with Irenaeus, the army's commander, and represented Pharaoh Ptolemy, our lord. I led him to understand what I had discovered: the Pharaoh's fortune. The Lady of the Two Lands, Isis, was the one who ordained them, and the powerful god Thoth was the one who recorded them. I dreamt as follows. Isis, the powerful goddess of Egypt and the land of Syria, is walking on the face of the Syrian sea's water. Thoth stands before her and takes her hand, leading her to the harbor in Alexandria. She said, "Alexandria is secure against the enemy. Pharaoh and his brother are recorded within it. The eldest son of Pharaoh wears the diadem. His son wears the diadem after him. The son of this son wears the diadem after him. The son of this son wears the diadem after him, for many lengthy days. This is confirmed when the queen gives birth to a male child." This dream threw Hor into the midst of political events. At first, his commander, Irenaeus, refused to believe all this Egyptian. But when Antiochus was forced to retreat, he began to take his prophet more seriously, even arranging an interview with the 2 Ptolemies and the queen. This took place in the Serapeum in Alexandria on August 29, 168, and it is an unusual testimony to how mobile Egyptian society could be during this period. Finally, Irenaeus began to write letters of credentials for his Egyptian friend. This conversion of Irenaeus is an individual example of an important movement in the history of thought, the Orientalization of the Greeks. To earlier classicists such as Gilbert Murray or E.R. Dodds, this reversion appeared as a failure of nerve, but to an Egyptologist it looks more like a homecoming. The fusion of Egyptian religion with Greek philosophy began at places like Saqqara, and the god of Hor, Thoth, the 3 times great, became Hermes Trismegistos, celebrated as the font of pagan learning even down to the Renaissance. Hor's gods did not desert him, but began to drive him south to Memphis. The following text is, in some ways, the common denominator of this final chapter. Memphis produced a pointed shroud in the late 2nd century AD. This shows the deceased as a young man wearing a tunic and mantle, flanked by the jackal-headed Anubis, 9 wide to the next world, and the full face. The image represents Osiris, the lord of the afterlife. Day 12, the festival of Thoth. The first dream was that a young master, overseer, was with me on a labor gang and had paid my exemption money. I pretended to be absent in my dream, but they pursued me and stopped me in Sebenitos. They brought me to the place where my master was. I was very afraid. My master led me to the temple and said, "Whore, you are on trial. I shall remain silent, and you will discover this is a serious charge. You must go. You may not stand before me. I am your master, Thoth. I told you before, do not worship any god except me." I replied, "I will not do it again." A great man came from the town of Pyboin to give him a scroll bearing the destiny of the temple of Pyboin. This said, "You will be with your word, promising to remain with him, the god, throughout your days of life. Should calamities occur as part of what is ordained, one man, one fate." In my second dream, I found myself in the necropolis of Memphis. A foul death had seized a poor man. I lifted him upon myself and brought him up to the Serapeum.
Do you hear that? Sounds like breakfast is ready. Because Quaker's coming in hot with morning nutrition. 100% whole grain oats and a good source of fiber to fuel the rhythm of your morning and kickstart your day. And that sounds absolutely delicious. Fuel to start whatever's next. Quaker, official sponsor of FIFA World Cup 26.
Let's go! I reached the processional way. A ghost called, "Come to me, I have found a house that is built." I told him, "The house that is built is better than a house that lacks its roof beams." He sat in the middle of the way and said, "Bring your clover, the food for the 60,000 ibises." I said to him, "It is in Pi-Thoth." He said, "Bring it here with your things." He added, "You shall have a living soul from the 35th day, halfway through the mummification process. You will pass away in Memphis, and your final resting place will be the Serapeum. Hear the words that I shall say to you. Go before Thoth and say, 'Come to me, my great lord Thoth. Beautiful is the lifetime long in festival.' Go before Isis and say, 'Come to me, my lady Isis. Beauty is burial within the precincts of Memphis.' Go before Osiris and say before Osiris, 'Come to me, my great lord Osiris. Beautiful is this house upon the deserts of Memphis. Beautiful is the resting place of the Serapeum.'" We have written all these things specifically for you. At first sight, these two dreams seem unconnected, but there are several common themes. There is the idea of assisting the weak. Hor receives help from his overseer, who turns out to be divine, and in the second dream, he tries to extend help to the poor man. In both dreams, there is insecurity. Powerful figures, the foreman, and the ghost, interrogate the dreamer and force him to admit his inadequacy. He tells the master, "I will not do it again." When asked about the clover, he replies that he left it at home. But above all, it is clear that in both dreams, he is being told the same thing, and it is a source of hope. To devote himself to worshipping Thoth, the god of learning, and settle in Memphis. After this experience, Hor adopted the name Harthoth, or Horus Thoth. We can only speculate on the state of mind that produced a conversion of this sort, but the one thing we cannot deny is that Hor believed that it happened. Awake, he had met Ptolemy VI. Asleep, he saw Hermes Trismegistos. Was such a dream the sort of thing that could turn a man into a Kotoko? In later life, Hor of Sebenitos became involved in a scandal over the administration of the sacred ibises. He was disgraced and may have lost his job. At one point, he wrote down a dream about his hometown and the world's end. Some of his ostraca are drafts for a somewhat self-righteous petition he wrote to the king, to remind him of his success as a prophet of the gods and to obtain justice. As with Papyrus Rylands II, we do not know the outcome. Like his four companions, Hor of Sebennytos goes into the darkness, and soon his sovereign follows him, thrown from a horse in Syria at a moment of what looks like triumph. One of the king's sons died at the age of 20. The other wore the diadem after him, but not for very many lengthy days, since he was murdered by his uncle. One man, one fate. He of the quiet heart, as the Egyptians termed Osiris, knows every name. Such is Osiris. Hail to thee, Osiris, son of the sky goddess Nut, to whom was given the white crown of joy in the presence of the Ennead, whose awesomeness Atum created in the hearts of men, gods, spirits, and the dead, who was given the scepter in Heliopolis, great of transformations in Busiris, of whom the great and powerful are in dread, for whom the great ones rise to their feet upon their mats. Such is Osiris, sovereign of the gods, the greatest power of heaven, ruler of the living, the divine king, Nesu of those who are yonder. When the gods see him, they praise him. When the spirits see him, they embrace the ground. Many thousands surround him in Abydos, and the underworld rejoices. These words are taken from a funerary stela found at the site of Osiris' principal cult center, Abydos, in Upper Egypt. It is now in the Louvre, but many similar texts exist in other collections. Osiris was the god and ruler of the dead, and hymns in his honor are standard in the funerary cult throughout ancient Egyptian history. Although he is prominently featured in Egyptian religion, the origins of Osiris are a mystery. His name is written with 3 hieroglyphs, an open eye standing above a stylized seat or throne, and the sign for a god. This combination defies the conventional interpretations of these signs, implying that the writing dates back to when the hieroglyphic script was still in its experimental stages. If the name is foreign to Egyptian culture, it remains unidentified in any other language. The god is certainly ancient, but hardly mentioned in the earliest texts. Osiris begins to make a serious appearance in the pyramid texts, a body of hymns and incantations carved on the walls of the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties. This material may be centuries old when written. In this early literature, Osiris is mentioned sparingly, and only in contexts that make it clear that gods and men were held to be in awe of him. Osiris, the dreaded lord of the afterlife, commands respect even from the deceased king whose monument the pyramid texts aim to adorn. It is best to leave him to the silence, as he is primeval. Osiris is often considered an interloper at Abydos, the place that became the principal center of his worship. In the earliest inscriptions from this site, a deity known as Khenti Amentia appears, the foremost of the Westerners. In later times, Osiris fulfilled precisely the same role as Khenti Amentia. This is too much of a coincidence, even for the complex overlap characterizing Egyptian religion. The likelihood is that Khenti Amentiu was the title of Osiris all along. The true name of the god was too awesome to be mentioned, and a less disturbing epithet was chosen to stand in its place. The later appearances of Osiris are more attractive. Any Egyptian who could afford a coffin or a funerary stela after his death could call himself Osiris in the first intermediate period of Hekanakht and his letters. Going into the next life meant standing before Osiris for judgment, seeking vindication against death and other enemies, just as he had been. Being immortal meant transforming into Osiris, implying that a life with the god must be an enticing prospect. At some point, perhaps in the Middle Kingdom, one of the earliest royal tombs at Abydos was rediscovered and declared to be the burial place of the god himself. The phrase from the stela quoted above mentions thousands of worshippers circulating around him. It probably refers to mass pilgrimages, similar in some ways to those held to this day around the sacred Kaaba in Mecca. People went to Osiris in this life, as well as in the next. Numerous Egyptian sources contain fragments of the fully developed myth of Osiris and his sister wife Isis, but Plutarch's De Isaide et Osiride, written just before AD 120, contains the most detailed account. In this version, the various strands that make up Osiris mythology have merged. Although a god, he had lived on earth as a king of Egypt, creating most of the benefits that were the essence of Egyptian civilization. In this respect, he resembles the cultural heroes of other traditions. He was killed by the treachery of his brother Seth, the god of disruption, but was brought back to life by the magic of Ophelsis and his colleague Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom. He is the dead king, wearing the white crown upon his head, which symbolizes the Nesu, the divine aspect of the Pharaoh. His body was the land of Egypt, divided into provinces, each containing a relic of his limbs. The waters of the Nile, which flooded and gave life to the earth of the Nile Valley every year, also received him. However, his true realm was not of this world, as he sat in perpetual rule over the dead. In this aspect, he is nothing less than the sun at night, giving light and sustenancy to the netherworld. In several tombs of the New Kingdom, including that of Queen Nefertari, there is a scene during which a staff or pole is surmounted by the head of a ram-colored green like the vegetation of Egypt. The hieroglyphic caption to this scene reads, "This is the sun god, Re who sets as Osiris. This is Osiris who rises as Re." Rich or poor, literate or illiterate, the ancient Egyptians were the heirs of this god who had once ruled their land and before whose judgment they would eventually find themselves. Some of the 12 characters in this book will have died with his name on their lips or ears, and it is no coincidence that he recurs throughout these pages. One of his other names was Onofri, the perfect or complete being, so he can be seen as the personification of ancient Egypt.